On July 7, 2024, an officer pulled over a driver for a suspended license. Miss Renee, a composed and ambitious 26-year-old, begins her day with confidence, ready to tackle her routine tasks. A rising star in her field, she is accustomed to navigating challenges with poise, balancing her professional ambitions with a meticulously organized personal life. This particular morning feels no different. Dressed sharply in her favorite tailored blazer, she grabs her coffee, glances at her to-do list, and steps into her car. Her mind races through the day ahead, meetings, deadlines, and the promise of a much-needed dinner with friends to celebrate her latest career milestone. Oblivious to the storm brewing, she adjusts the rearview mirror and starts the engine, unaware of the unresolved administrative error tied to her driver's license. The oversight, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic miscommunication, is a ticking time bomb. 4 weeks, an unnoticed notice from the DMV had been sitting in her mailbox, warning of a suspension due to a clerical mix-up. Miss Renee, ever diligent but human, had missed it amidst the avalanche of correspondence. As she merges onto the freeway, the routine hum of her morning is interrupted by flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skips a beat as the siren wails. She signals, pulls over, and begins to gather her documents, her composure intact but her mind clouded with questions. What begins as a simple traffic stop soon spirals into a confrontation that will test the very fabric of her resilience. A routine day turns extraordinary, marking the beginning of an ordeal that challenges not just her composure but her understanding of fairness and justice. During her drive, Renee was startled by the wail of a siren and flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Pulling over, she watched the officer's reserved demeanor approach, signaling something unusual. "Miss Renee," the officer began, "your driver's license is suspended, and your vehicle's plates are recalled due to unpaid financial obligations." Renee's confusion deepened. "That's impossible," she insisted. "I've settled all my dues." The officer's tone remained firm. "The system shows outstanding fines. I'm required to impound your vehicle." Renee's heart raced as disbelief gave way to frustration. Gripping the steering wheel, she resolved to uncover the truth behind the unexpected ordeal. The officer returned to Renee's window, holding a folded stack of documents. His expression remained stern, the weight of protocol evident in his stance. He handed her the papers, gesturing for her to review them. "These are the records validating the suspension and recall," he said firmly. "The notice was issued weeks ago, outlining unpaid fines and the resulting penalties." Renee unfolded the documents, scanning the dense legal text. Her brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages, noting unfamiliar charges and a suspension date she couldn't reconcile. Suppressing a rising tide of frustration, she looked up at the officer. "There has to be a mistake," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I've paid every fine I've ever received. Can we double-check this? I need time to verify these records with the DMV." The officer's posture stiffened slightly, his voice unyielding. "Ma'am, the information in the system is clear. My duty is to enforce the order as issued. Compliance is not optional." Renee took a deep breath, her composure unwavering despite his rigidity. "I'm not refusing to comply," she explained. "I just want to ensure this is accurate before my car is impounded. If this is a mistake, it could disrupt my entire day, my entire week." The officer sighed, glancing back toward his patrol car. "I understand your frustration, but I'm not authorized to delay enforcement. If you believe there's been an error, you'll need to resolve it through the proper channels after the fact." The tension between them was palpable, a clash between Renee's logical, composed approach and the officer's strict adherence to procedure. As he stepped back to radio for the impound team, Renee clenched her jaw, her mind racing. Despite the injustice she felt, she knew she had to stay calm to navigate the situation without further escalation. The officer handed Renee a clipboard with a violation report, pointing to the line where her signature was required. "Please sign here to acknowledge receipt of the notice, ma'am," he said, his tone firm but neutral. Renee stared at the document, her hands trembling slightly. The accusations listed, license suspension, unpaid obligations, plate recall, felt surreal, a stark contradiction to her meticulously managed life. Her heart raced as her mind churned, searching for an explanation. "I can't sign this," she said after a moment, her voice low but resolute. "I don't agree with these claims, and I need time to process what's happening. Signing this feels like admitting to something I didn't do." The officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, signing doesn't indicate guilt, it simply acknowledges you've received the notice. Refusing to sign won't change the outcome, but it will escalate the situation." Renee hesitated, torn between compliance and her growing sense of injustice. "I'm overwhelmed right now," she admitted. "I need clarity before I can sign anything. Can't this wait until I've had a chance to verify the records?" The officer's patience wore thin. He stepped back, speaking into his radio to initiate a secondary protocol. "Miss Renee," he said sternly, "if you refuse to comply, I'll have to ask you to step out of the vehicle." The request felt like a line being crossed. Trapped between her principles and the mounting pressure, Renee instinctively resisted. "Why do I need to leave the car?" she asked, her tone sharp with apprehension. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's voice became more commanding. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Step out of the vehicle now." Renee's chest tightened. Her logical side urged her to cooperate, but the weight of the moment, the perceived injustice, the abrupt shift from routine to crisis, paralyzed her. "No," she said softly but firmly, gripping the steering wheel. The escalation was swift. The officer called for backup, and within minutes, additional patrol cars surrounded her vehicle. As the situation intensified, Renee realized the gravity of her defiance but felt cornered, her emotions clouding her judgment. Eventually, with the officers pressing the issue, she was forcibly removed from the car, her resistance culminating in her arrest. As she was led away in handcuffs, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and humiliation flooded her mind. The ordinary morning had unraveled completely, leaving her facing the harsh reality of an escalating legal ordeal. Back at the station, the officer who had initiated the arrest stood in the briefing room, explaining the situation to his colleagues. His voice was calm, almost mechanical, as he recounted the events that led to Renee's detainment. The subject refused to sign the violation report, citing emotional distress, he explained, his posture rigid with professionalism. "She resisted when asked to exit the vehicle, and I followed standard procedure. I had no choice but to arrest her for obstruction." Some officers nodded in agreement, their expressions stoic, acknowledging the strict adherence to protocol. But there were others who exchanged uneasy glances. One officer, leaning against a desk, spoke up. "It seems a little extreme, don't you think? She was just upset. Couldn't we have handled it differently?" Another officer, a senior member, shrugged. "I get it, but rules are rules. She had to know the consequences for non-compliance. The law is the law." But the murmurs of doubt lingered, and the officer's once unwavering confidence in his actions seemed to waver, if only for a moment. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Renee sat on a bench, her arms crossed tightly, as though trying to hold herself together. The sterile, cold walls of the station felt oppressive, each tick of the clock echoing in her mind. She replayed the events over and over, the confusion, the escalating tension, the helplessness of being cornered by the system she had always trusted. Her frustration grew with every passing minute. How did it come to this? She thought, clenching her jaw. She had always done her best to stay on top of things, paying her bills, keeping her records clean, and obeying the law. And yet, now she found herself in a holding cell, accused of something she had no understanding of. As her mind raced through the details, she couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The officer had seemed indifferent to her confusion, to her genuine desire to clear things up. She had tried to cooperate, tried to maintain her composure, but everything had spiraled out of her control. She thought of the violation report, the documents that had seemed like a labyrinth of legal jargon. What if they were wrong? What if they had made a mistake? Her breathing quickened as a sense of injustice settled heavily in her chest. She had always been a law-abiding citizen, never in trouble, yet now she was being treated like a criminal. The arrest, the humiliation, the uncertainty, these things felt like a slap in the face. I don't deserve this, she thought, the weight of the situation sinking in. I followed the rules. Why am I being punished for something I didn't do? As she sat there, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours, Renee made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to clear her name, to uncover the truth behind the bureaucratic mess that had led to her arrest. She couldn't let this unjust situation define her. It wasn't just a matter of proving her innocence, it was a fight for her dignity and her future. Renee sat in the quiet of her apartment, the weight of the day still pressing heavily on her chest. The hours since her release felt like a blur, each minute stretching painfully as she replayed the events in her mind. She had been detained, questioned, and treated like a criminal, all for something she believed was a mistake. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee mug absent-mindedly as she tried to process what had happened. Did I handle it wrong? The question gnawed at her. Had she been too calm, too controlled in the face of the officer's rigid approach? Or had she been right to demand time to verify the records? Was there a better way? She couldn't stop questioning herself, her decisions, her responses. She had been determined to stay composed, to trust in the fairness of the system, but now, sitting alone, all she could feel was the bitter sting of injustice. Her thoughts spiraled. I've always followed the rules, done everything right. How could something like this happen to me? The arrest had shattered her sense of security, and now she was left with a sinking feeling of powerlessness. She thought about the officer's cold professionalism, his insistence on procedure, and the sense that her concerns had been dismissed. Was there no room for empathy in the system? Renee knew she needed clarity, something to anchor her in the chaos of the situation. But first, she needed to talk to someone. Her mind wandered to her friends and family, to those who had always been her sounding board in times of doubt. She reached for her phone and dialed her sister, hoping for some comfort, some semblance of understanding. "Hey, it's me," Renee said as soon as the call connected, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need to talk." Her sister's voice on the other end was warm and concerned. "Of course. What happened?" Renee took a deep breath, recounting the events of the day, how she'd been pulled over, the officer's accusations, the escalation, and ultimately, her arrest. As she spoke, her emotions began to rise, but she forced herself to stay composed, not wanting to break down completely. "I just don't understand," she continued. "I tried to do everything right. I was polite, I explained I needed time to verify things. But it just kept escalating. And now I feel like I'm caught in this mess with no way out." Her sister listened intently, offering quiet reassurances. "Renee, you were trying to do the right thing. This isn't your fault. I know this must feel like an attack, but we'll figure this out together." But even as her sister spoke, Renee couldn't shake the feeling that the system was designed to shut people like her out. People who trusted the process, people who didn't expect to be caught in the web of bureaucracy. She ended the call feeling a little less alone, but still uncertain. Later, she reached out to a close friend, someone she trusted to offer a different perspective. They listened to her frustrations, providing their own experiences with the legal system. "It sounds like a breakdown in communication. You did the right thing by staying calm. But honestly, this whole thing just shouldn't have happened." Despite the comfort, Renee found herself back where she started, feeling confused and angry, still unsure about the consequences of her arrest. What did it mean for her career? Her reputation? What would the DMV find when they reviewed the records? The reflection continued to weigh on her as the night grew late. Her mind returned to the paperwork, the details she had tried to understand but couldn't. I need to clear this up. I have to prove I'm not in the wrong. She couldn't let this unjust situation define her. Renee decided that tomorrow she would take action, call the DMV, track down the missing details, and seek answers. In the solitude of her apartment, Renee made a silent promise to herself. No matter how difficult it would be, she would confront the truth and fight to reclaim her peace of mind. She wasn't going to let the system win, not without a fight. Within hours of Renee's release, a bystander's video of the incident began circulating on social media. The footage, shaky at first, captured the pivotal moment when the officer asked Renee to step out of her car, followed by her reluctance and the escalating tension. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the officer's rigid stance, and as the video spread, it quickly gained traction, with countless users offering their opinions on what they had just witnessed. The reactions were swift and varied. Some viewers expressed sympathy for Renee, criticizing the officer's handling of the situation. She was calm, trying to work through the issue, and this is how she gets treated. One comment read, "How is this fair? This is a failure of the system." Another user added, "She was just trying to comply, and instead of resolving a mistake, it got blown up into an arrest." Supporters of Renee's actions flooded the comment sections, echoing her frustration. They rallied behind her refusal to sign the report, questioning why she was being forced into compliance without the opportunity to verify the alleged violation. "How can you expect someone to sign a document they don't understand?" one commenter posted. "This is about more than just a traffic stop. It's about the rights of individuals to challenge the system when it's wrong." On the other side, those who supported the officer's actions argued that protocol had been followed and that Renee's failure to comply had led to her arrest. "The officer did his job," one comment read. "If she had just signed the paper, this wouldn't have escalated. She's responsible for this." Another user defended the officer's strict enforcement, suggesting that rules and regulations were there for a reason and that failure to comply should have consequences. "She refused to cooperate, plain and simple." The officer had no choice but to act. As the debate raged on, the incident became a lightning rod for larger conversations about the efficiency and fairness of the legal and administrative systems. Many commenters began to focus not only on Renee's arrest, but also on the broader issues of bureaucratic inefficiency and the difficulties ordinary citizens face when trying to navigate government processes. One post raised a crucial point: how many other people are being punished for administrative errors they didn't create? The system is broken. We need more transparency and better communication. This sentiment resonated with others who shared similar frustrations about dealing with complex and opaque systems, whether it was with the DMV, tax offices, or the legal system at large. A growing chorus of voices called for reform, with many advocating for better systems of record-keeping and the ability to challenge errors before they escalated into serious consequences. Some even pointed to the officer's approach as emblematic of a culture of zero-tolerance enforcement, where empathy and understanding were often sacrificed in favor of rigid rule-following. As public interest in the incident snowballed, Renee's name became a symbol for a much larger issue: the growing tension between personal rights and the ever-expanding reach of institutional bureaucracy. The discourse around her arrest brought to the forefront concerns about how people's lives could be upended by seemingly minor clerical errors or a lack of transparency in government systems. For Renee, the ripple effect of the video was both a source of frustration and a glimmer of hope. While some might see her as a symbol of defiance, others viewed her as an example of how the system could fail even the most law-abiding individuals. In the swirl of public opinion, Renee realized that her personal fight was now part of a much larger conversation, one that could, potentially, bring about meaningful change. As the story continued to spread, Renee found herself caught in the whirlwind of social media, media coverage, and public scrutiny. She had become an unintended focal point in a national conversation about rights, accountability, and the flaws inherent in bureaucratic systems. Whether she would be able to navigate this new reality and use it to fuel positive change remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: her story had ignited a debate that wouldn't be easily ignored. In the days following the viral spread of her story, Renee found herself at a crossroads. The initial shock of her arrest had left her feeling powerless, but as the conversations around her situation gained momentum, a shift occurred within her. The outpouring of support and the discussions on social media had illuminated a deeper issue: the inefficiencies of the system, the lack of transparency in license suspension processes, and the difficulty of navigating bureaucratic red tape. Renee realized that her personal frustration had evolved into something larger, a call for reform. She could no longer focus solely on her own vindication. The more she reflected on the public discourse, the more she recognized that her experience was not an isolated incident but part of a systemic failure that impacted countless others. As her story continued to spread, it became clear to her that this was an opportunity to channel her anger and confusion into something far more impactful. Inspired by the conversations and the growing momentum, Renee made a decision. She would no longer remain silent. Instead, she would use her platform to advocate for change. She reached out to legal experts, community leaders, and advocates for civil rights, hoping to understand how to best approach the complex issues surrounding administrative errors and the overreach of bureaucratic systems. Her first meeting was with a group of local legal experts who had already been involved in advocacy work around unjust license suspensions and the lack of support for individuals trying to resolve administrative mistakes. They explained how many people, like Renee, had been caught in the same cycle of confusion and frustration, often facing dire consequences because they couldn't afford the time or resources to challenge these errors. Renee was struck by the number of people who had been wrongly penalized for clerical mistakes or technical issues, many of them unaware of the consequences until it was too late. This group worked to support these individuals, but the challenge was immense, and the need for reform was clear. With the legal experts' guidance, Renee began to draft a proposal aimed at improving how license suspension notifications were issued. The current process was often riddled with delays, unclear communication, and a lack of follow-up on administrative errors. The group wanted to create a system that not only ensured timely notifications but also allowed for immediate recourse when mistakes were made, something that was currently sorely lacking. Renee's newfound purpose became clear. She would fight for transparency, accountability, and the rights of individuals to easily challenge bureaucratic mistakes. Her focus shifted from seeking personal vindication to striving for collective progress. She began hosting meetings with community leaders and other individuals affected by similar issues. Their shared experiences helped her refine her vision, understanding the ways that administrative errors could disproportionately affect vulnerable populations who lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back. Renee realized that, in the face of overwhelming odds, those who fell through the cracks of the system were often the most vulnerable: low-income individuals, immigrants, and people of color. These groups were disproportionately impacted by bureaucratic inefficiencies, and Renee became determined to elevate their voices as part of her advocacy. As her platform grew, Renee's message resonated with a wide audience. She used social media not just to share her own story, but also to educate the public on the systemic flaws she had uncovered. She started collaborating with other advocates for civil rights, using her experience as an example of how bureaucracy could overreach and unjustly punish citizens. Her personal experience with the legal system, once a source of frustration, became a powerful tool for advocacy. Renee's shift in focus allowed her to find purpose in the midst of her pain. The collective energy of those around her, all striving for a fairer and more transparent system, helped her realize that her personal battle was just one part of a much larger movement for systemic change. She began speaking at local town halls, pushing for policy reform that would not only address the issues surrounding license suspensions but also extend to other bureaucratic processes where citizens were left vulnerable to administrative errors. She worked alongside lawmakers to propose legislation aimed at holding government agencies accountable for the errors they made and ensuring that people could resolve issues quickly and without fear of unjust consequences. Renee's advocacy grew in influence, but it wasn't without opposition. Some critics accused her of making too much of a single incident, claiming that there was no need to overhaul the system for a few isolated cases. But Renee pressed on, knowing that the change she was seeking could prevent countless other individuals from experiencing what she had. Her journey had started as an attempt to clear her name, but now it had evolved into a mission for justice, one that sought to create a more transparent, fair system for everyone. Renee had found her voice, and she was determined to use it to spark change. Renee's advocacy work reached a pivotal moment when she was invited to host a public forum, a space for open dialogue between citizens, law enforcement officers, and government officials. The event, a collaborative effort between local community leaders and policymakers, aimed to address the growing concerns about bureaucratic inefficiencies and the disproportionate impact of administrative errors on ordinary people. The forum was an opportunity to bring together all sides: the individuals who had suffered due to the system, the officers who enforced its rules, and the officials responsible for its design. As the day of the forum approached, Renee felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. This was her chance to take everything she had learned, the countless conversations, the research, the meetings with legal experts, and bring it to the forefront in front of a live audience. Her goal was clear: to foster understanding, to seek real solutions, and to advocate for reforms that would make the system more transparent, fair, and humane. When the forum finally began, it was held in a packed community center, with an audience made up of concerned citizens, local media, legal experts, and public officials. Renee took a deep breath as she stepped up to the podium, her hands slightly trembling but her resolve firm. She had prepared a statement, but she knew that this was not about speeches. It was about a conversation, about giving voice to the people who had been ignored or misunderstood by the very systems they relied on. "Thank you all for coming," Renee began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I stand here today not just as someone who was wronged, but as someone who believes that we all deserve a fair chance to be heard. This issue, this broken system, is not just my story. It's the story of so many others who have been punished for things they didn't do, for mistakes that were never theirs to begin with." She paused, letting her words settle in the room, and then continued, "I've learned a lot over the past few weeks. I've learned about the inefficiencies of the systems we rely on, and the human toll it takes on people who don't have the resources to fight back. But I've also learned that when we come together, when we put aside our differences and listen to each other, we can create real change." The room was quiet as Renee looked out at the audience, her words connecting with many who had been personally affected by similar issues. The panel of officers and officials sat in silence, listening carefully to her message. After she spoke, the forum opened up for questions and discussion. A police officer in the back of the room raised his hand, and when called upon, he spoke directly to Renee. "I've watched the video of what happened that day, and I have to say, my role in this could have been handled differently. We are trained to follow protocol, but I see now that sometimes that rigidity can make things worse. I think we need more training on empathy, on understanding the human side of enforcement. If I'd had more patience that day, maybe it wouldn't have escalated the way it did." Renee nodded, her heart lifting. This was the kind of conversation she had hoped for, an honest acknowledgement that change was needed, not just in the policies themselves, but in the way individuals were trained to interact within the system. Other community members followed suit, sharing their own stories of bureaucratic mishandling and asking for clearer communication channels and quicker resolutions for administrative errors. Several people advocated for the creation of a more transparent and accessible process for disputing fines or license suspensions, particularly for those without the resources to challenge mistakes effectively. By the end of the day, a clear consensus had emerged. Officials promised to review and revise communication protocols to ensure that all citizens received clear, timely notices regarding administrative actions that could affect their lives. A proposal was put forward for more training for law enforcement officers, emphasizing empathy and de-escalation techniques in situations where citizens might be confused or overwhelmed by legal or procedural issues. In the days that followed, a series of small but meaningful changes began to take shape. Renee worked with lawmakers to introduce a bill that would streamline the process for addressing bureaucratic mistakes, ensuring that individuals had easier access to dispute resolutions and faster responses from government agencies. She continued to collaborate with community leaders to ensure that the reforms were truly effective and that they were being implemented in ways that would protect those most vulnerable. Renee's transformation was complete. She had channeled her frustration, her anger, and her confusion into something positive, something that would help countless others in the future. Her ordeal, which had once felt like a personal injustice, had become a catalyst for a broader movement. As Renee walked away from the forum, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. It had been a long, difficult journey, but she knew that the path forward was one that would lead to real change. The dialogue that had taken place, the willingness to listen, to empathize, and to acknowledge flaws in the system, was just the beginning. She had sparked a movement, not just for her own justice, but for the fair treatment of all citizens. The story ended not with a single victory, but with the promise of a more equitable future. Renee's commitment to transformation, both personal and societal, had brought about a sense of unity and hope. And as she looked toward the future, she knew this was just the start. She had proven that one person's determination could make a difference, and in that truth, there was the promise of a better tomorrow for all. If you find this story interesting and filled with meaningful lessons, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to learn more valuable lessons.